All right, so we've done a couple things. We've played with drop shadows, we've played with the background a little bit. And the next tool I want to talk about is the gradient tool. And I have a love-hate with this tool because it can look very campy very quickly. And so we're going to talk about ways to use it that keep it from looking like a PowerPoint from 1998. So for now, again, like I did before, I'm actually just going to move this out of the way. And I'm going to come back to my letter. And if yours is still set to live paint, again, if it's on live paint, it'll have those little kind of crosshairs all around it. We're going to want to turn that off. And so you can do that by hitting expand. And then we're going to ungroup it for now. And now with the object ungrouped, we can play around with individual kind of shapes. And so what I want you to do is under window, if you open that, we're going to open up a couple things. Make sure that you have your swatch panel open. Again, it's just helpful to see everything in front of you. And then the next thing we're going to open is our gradient tool. And right now, if I click this, we have this really, really not so attractive steel gray gradient that pops up. So we don't want to do that. So I'm going to hit Command Z. And what I'm actually going to do, rather than selecting individual pieces of my shape, and again, you'll notice I just had to ungroup it. I'm actually going to test this out in a smaller area, not part of the letters, just because it's a little bit easier to read. So if you go over to your toolbar, you can either make a circle, square, it doesn't matter. But we're going to use this to test our gradients just because it takes up a little bit more space and I can see more clearly what it's going to do. And so with this circle selected, if you go back to your gradient panel, we're going to add some colors to this that are a little bit more exciting than black and white. So I'm going to go into my swatches and maybe I want like, I don't know, really dark purple. So I'm going to click it and drag it and I'm going to pull it down to my panel. And maybe I want this to transition to a blue, so I'm going to add a blue. And maybe it gets even lighter, or maybe I want to get wild and have it become orange because it's a party. And as you can see, all of that's impacting what's happening in this circle right here. And is it impacting it in a good way? Right now, I would say it's a little bit ugly. So we're going to have to spruce this up a bit. So the first thing we can do is we're going to get rid of those black and white swatches. So if I just click on that circle and then hit the trash can, it will delete those different colors. And now if I move these, it determines where my colors will transition. And these little diamonds on top will determine how much purple versus how much blue, where that transition starts to happen between them. So if I bring this closer to the blue, you'll notice that I have this really tight blue band and a really subtle transition. Whereas if I keep it closer to the center, it's going to be a softer gradient. And the other thing I can do, if I'm feeling like maybe that orange is still a little heavy, is if I click on this, I can drop the opacity down on just that orange color. So maybe if I drop it to 70 and let it kind of taper out a little bit. And now what we can do, because this feels sort of, I would say kind of sunset-like, we're going to change the angle of this so it isn't vertical. And to do that, if you come over to your panel right here, if I click on this icon, I can then, we'll say 90 degrees, flip it. And now we have a gradient headed downward, which feels a little bit more natural for what we're doing. And so if I love this, if I'm feeling like, yes, this is the gradient I have been waiting for, I can then go over to my panel and I can click it and drag it and pull it right back into my swatches panel. Beautiful. But I would also say this still feels a little bit intense. And so there are a few things that we're going to do to diffuse this so it doesn't have this kind of really kind of intense band in the middle. So what I want you to do is if you click on this object, we're just going to copy and paste it. And now if I go back to my original circle, if I pick a more neutral color, so maybe we go light blue or even maybe yellow, we'll see what happens. And I bring this over the top, you'll notice that now this bottom hue is kind of becoming a little bit more intense because I already dropped the opacity down on that orange color. But if I come over here, if I drop the opacity here, it starts to bring down the opacity of the whole gradient, which is a great way of kind of softening the intensity and allowing that element underneath to come through. And so I can play around with, maybe I want something a little less intense than yellow. You know, yellow and purple complementary colors could be a little bit much. The other thing we can do is if I turn this gradient back on, and I'm going to adjust the angle so it's maybe diagonal. And I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to drop the opacity down a little bit. And if I bring this back over, they start to kind of fuse a little bit. And so instead of having two really harsh lines, those lines become a little bit softer and blend together a little bit. And I can play with how much or how little I want them to do this. But you can see I've got something that feels a little bit more smooth. And so now if I go back to my letter R, if I wanted to apply that to elements there, if I click on the face of my R, I'm going to do two things. First, I'm going to copy it and paste it by hitting Command C and Command V. And now if I go over to my swatch panel, I can click on that gradient. I can change the angle of it. And I can bring it right back over the top. And now because I have that slightly lower opacity, that blue still comes through. I've got that subtle orange, but it's nowhere near as intense as it was a few minutes ago. So again, if you do choose to play with the gradient tool, which I encourage you to play around with it, just be mindful that we tend to want to knock it back a few steps. And the best way to do that, I find, is either by layering or by playing with that opacity tool, or a combination of the two. And that will give you some kind of more subtle and more sophisticated changes in hue.